My name is Evelyn March, 68, retired auditor. Once upon a time, people sent me neat emails with thank you in the subject line. I still keep some printed in a shoebox, a silly archive of usefulness. These days, it's just me and the house. Graham left a square-shouldered place with a walnut table he varnished himself and a chimney that leans a fraction of an inch toward the maple out front. We raised one child here, our son Caleb. I believed foolishly, as it turns out, that belief could hold a family together the way mortar holds brick. It began on a Thursday that smelled like cardamom and pears. I was at the counter slicing fruit for a tart I'd promised Caleb. He always asked for less sugar, more spice, so Dad won't complain. The kettle chattered, the timer blinked. My phone vibrated across the cutting board and lodged in a little drift of flour. A voice message from Caleb, odd because we'd spoken that morning about nothing in particular. I pressed play with a floured thumb and heard first a scrape of chairs, then Mara's voice sweetened to the edge of cruelty. She's hanging on. Once the papers are in place, we're done. Caleb's reply was low and careless, a stranger wearing my son's tone. 7.8, he said like he was reading a weather report. Then we're out of this town. We deserve it. Laughter overlapping, a door shutting, silence. My hand stayed steady. My lungs did not. Something that had lived loyally in me for decades folded in on itself like a cart house in a draft. I pressed the triangle again. Again. They sounded like young employees gossiping in a break room, not two adults I had fed, housed, and forgiven more times than the calendar could track. The pears burned. A film of sugar blackened along the pan's rim and sent up a thin, bitter thread. I did not move. I stared at the dent in the refrigerator where Caleb rammed his bicycle when he was 10 and insisted he hadn't. The wind pushed me, he said, crying, and I believed him because believing him seemed like love. On the sideboard sits Graham's photograph in a crooked copper frame. He's in his fishing cap, 2 fingers raised like an oath. Caleb used to have that expression when he was sure of a thing, the last goal of the season, the first day of his job. Now certainty had a new subject. I carried the phone to the walnut table and set it between the salt cellar and the tiny oil bottle that smells of rosemary. I placed both palms on the wood and felt the old varnish smooth as an old hymn. When the breath evened out, I called Elaine Litt, the attorney who had drafted our documents. Her voicemail caught me on the second ring. Elaine, I said, voice calm in a way that frightened me, please activate the transfer provisions we discussed and file the trustee notice. Today, if possible. I ended the call and stayed very still so the world would not notice it had tilted. There are years I could catalog for you, the double shifts after Graham's aneurysm, the nights I set a plate for 2 and ate alone because a boy needed new cleats, and a mother had only so much to sell. I woke at 4:30 for a decade to make lunches with little slips of paper tucked inside. You can do hard things. He pretended not to read them at 15. He kept one in his wallet at 23. Mara Voss arrived in our lives with a lemon loaf and a nervous laugh. She had a constellation of freckles across her nose and called me my Evie, like she'd known me forever. She admired the heavy stoneware mug Graham's mother had brought from Vermont and traced the thumbprint glaze with a fingertip. It looks like it remembers stories, she said. I poured her the good tea from the cobalt tin and slid the mug across the table. It became a ritual blue tin and warm mug and the gentleness of ordinary afternoons. Then came layoffs and a burst pipe and the rent relief that outlived its name. The guest room turned into a bridge, then a cul-de-sac. I paid the heating bill when the account overdrafted. I drove Mara to physical therapy after her accident and sat in the waiting room, knitting crooked rows that unraveled when I got home. I signed for the used hybrid because the interest rate would bury them. Each time I wrote a check, I told myself this is what mothers do. We stay upright and let the storm use us as a windbreak. Of late, the house had been noisier but lonelier. Evelyn replaced Ma Evie. Caleb looked up from his phone less often. We had an unspoken ceremony every evening. I set 3 plates. They texted we already ate. I kept setting the plates like I was practicing an instrument no one else could hear. The day after the voicemail, I baked a tray of almond cookies because the oven doesn't argue. The air smelled like December. I expected a question about a time a ride, some gentle nuisance that suggests your life is needed. The phone rang and delivered something colder. Hi, Evelyn, Mara said in that voice you use for patient receptionists. Just letting you know we got married yesterday. Super intimate. Only our inner circle. I looked across the hall at the pale linen dress hanging from a nail and the pair of low heels waiting by the door. I had ordered them because one hopes even when one knows better. I see, I said, which is not the same as I understand. Mara kept talking a vineyard. Her sister sang sparklers at dusk. She paused only to say, we'll swing by next week for the decorator balance. I had wired the venue deposit 6 months earlier. I had cashed the last of Graham's mint set to do it. Of course I said, and I meant only that my mouth could form sentences. When the line went dead, I found the stoneware mug and poured tea to its brim and to the brim of its twin out of muscle memory. Steam climbed the kitchen window. I set both mugs on the table and waited for neither of them to be lifted. Then, careful as a nurse with a feverish child, I poured the second mug back into the pot and turned it upside down on its saucer. I told the empty room 1 cup is enough. I didn't cry. I walked to the small office, woke the old printer, and opened the folder on my desktop called Caleb and Mara Assistants. For years I had tucked receipts there the way some mothers save macaroni necklaces. Rent top-ups, insurance premiums during the months he was between things, emergency dental, the down payment on the hybrid, the PT bills after the accident, the venue deposit, the dress fittings, groceries, holidays, plane tickets for a trip they insisted was essential to their mental health. I printed everything in pages, sliding warm onto the carpet. At the table, I used a small calculator with a half-rubbed on button and added line after line as if I were proofing a stranger's ledger. The total blinked on the gray screen, $284,600. I didn't feel poorer or richer, only suddenly fluent. My love had a conversion rate. The absurdity is I did not regret the money. When you are a parent, numbers are a language you translate into needs, heat breaks, food tuition. You translate again into relief. You tuck your own dental appointment into a pocket of never and make soup from a freezer of odds and ends. But the ledger told another story alongside the first, the cost of being uninvited from a life you built. I returned to the file cabinet, found the binder with the March Family Trust, and slid out the tab pages Elaine had prepared years ago. The paper smelled faintly of dust and citrus cleaner. Upon the settler's death, Graham had written in his awkward, careful hand on a note he insisted she include the trust. Corpus shall pass to Evelyn March outright and thereafter be distributed at her discretion. There was a clause we added later: after a rough Thanksgiving, distributions are contingent upon respectful participation in the family unit. Vague, yes, kindness usually is, but the law didn't need poetry to stand. I read those pages twice, then a third time, the way you reread a blessing you've forgotten how to receive. In the living room, the pale dress watched me like a witness. The blue tin on the counter shone dully in the late light. I set the documents in a stack and aligned their corners with the edge of the table, because order is sometimes the first mercy you can give yourself. When the kettle clicked again, I made another cup of tea and carried it to the porch. The maple was restless leaves, freckled with the first brown of the season. Across the street, Mrs. Doyle watered her hanging ferns. She gave me a little wave, and I lifted the mug like a toast to quiet. Somewhere in the house, the oven ticking cooled like a clock recalibrating after a power cut. Back inside, I wiped the flour from the countertop, rinsed the pan with the blackened sugar rink, and set it in the drying rack. I collected the printed pages into a slim manila folder and wrote "for records" in small block letters. The phone lay face down, dark as a closed eye. I turned it over and out of a habit I could not break in a single afternoon, checked the lock screen. No messages. I powered it down and placed it gently on the walnut, a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence I had taken too long to finish. That night, I slept with the lamp on, not because I was afraid, but because the house felt newly true, and I wanted to see it as it was. In the morning, I would do ordinary things in an ordinary order: boil water, sweep the porch, fold the blanket on the arm of the chair. The dress would come off its nail. The second saucer would go back on the shelf. The ledger would return to the file. For the first time in a long while, I let the day end without asking it to be kinder than it had the strength to be. Morning arrived without spectacle, just a pale square of light sliding up the kitchen wall, and the kettle beginning its soft breath. I boiled water, rinsed the pan with last night's sugared scorch, and swept flour into my palm like sand from an unlucky beach. The house felt unornamented, as if someone had stripped ribbons from it in the night, and left only the structure: a chair, a table, a woman who had decided that one teacup was enough. I called Elaine Litt at 9, not to revisit anything but to confirm what had already begun. She answered this time. Her voice lived in that narrow place between brisk and kind. I filed the trustee notice, she said. You remain the sole authority. I thanked her. We said very little, and yet a room inside me unlocked. Next, I dialed a number from the sticker near the back door, a locksmith I'd used years ago to rescue a rattling doorknob. Darius Pike arrived in a van the color of asphalt. He wiped his boots on the mat and studied the deadbolt Caleb had installed last winter, with a sigh that implied workmanship was a form of moral stance. Change them all, I said, front, side, back, garage, and the shed. He didn't ask why. His tools made a language of clean metallic notes. The old brass dropped into his bucket with a small final music. I watched from the hall as cylinders came free, as new keys shook in my palm like tiny silver fish. When he left, I pressed each key into a labeled envelope: front, back, side, garage, Shed. The labels made me feel methodical instead of alone. At the bank, the lobby smelled faintly of citrus disinfectant and old receipts. Theo Alvarez, the young officer who'd once helped Graham and me dispute a double charge on a restaurant bill, led me into his glass-walled office and closed the door with courtesy. "I need to remove Caleb March from all linked and authorized access," I said. "Close the automatic transfers. Replace every password. Two-factor with my landline." Theo nodded. He moved through the screens with the respectful gravity of a librarian handling a rare book. He printed forms. He slid them toward me with a pen that had the bank's logo in navy. I signed the loop of my M steady. He hesitated once, not with doubt but with care, and said, "If you would like, I can flag any unusual attempts." "It's a standard measure." "Please," I said. There was no dramatics in it, just a favor a human being can offer another. At the florist between the bakery and the dry cleaner, I bought ranunculus the color of late peaches, their petals layered like secrets told gently. The florist, a woman with a haircut that refused to decide between tidy and wild, wrapped them in brown paper and green twine. "For someone special?" she asked. "For a kitchen window," I said. It felt like an answer. Back home, I set the flowers in a jar that had once held preserved lemons and opened the windows to let the house rewrite its own air. The maple flickered. I put on a record Graham had loved, quiet jazz with a bass line that walked like an old friend, and I listened to the way the upright strings met the light through the screen. At 4 p.m, a knock came. Not the neighbor's tap or Darius's workman's rap. This one had the rhythm of rehearsal, a sound that expected agreement. When I opened the door, Caleb stood on the stoop in a pale jacket he'd never wear to help me carry wood. Beside him, Mara polished as glass. Behind them, a woman I didn't know in a charcoal suit carrying a leather portfolio. "Mom," Caleb said, smoothing his tie that didn't need smoothing. "Can we come in?" I stepped back because the house is still a house. They entered with the posture of people arriving at a meeting they believed was theirs to run. The woman introduced herself as Ms. Albright. She chose the armchair without asking, set her portfolio on her knees, and clasped her hands. A small silver watch winked at her wrist. "We brought a few documents," she said. "Given your recent distractions, Evelyn, it's prudent to ensure protections are in place. Nothing binding without your consent, of course." Mara perched on the sofa arm and touched the mantel with the faintest brush of her fingernails, as if testing for dust. "We've been worried," she said, pitched to sympathy. "You've been so independent. It's a lot." Ms. Albright laid out 3 stacks of paper with the neat choreography of a croupier. I saw their titles without letting them inform my face: Durable Power of Attorney, Healthcare Directive, Limited Access to Trust Disbursements. The last stack bore more pages and the indistinct weight of a process that wanted to be permanent. I didn't sit. I stood with my hand on the back of the chair Graham had sanded smooth. "You're proposing to manage my life," I said, almost conversational. "And my money." "That's not fair," Caleb said too fast. "It's just to take the load off you." "Loads have names," I said. "Let's be polite enough to speak them." I reached into the drawer of the walnut console and took out a small USB drive taped inside a white envelope. I set it on the table, not a flourish, simply gravity in a new shape. "This contains a recording," I said. "An accident, I believe. A conversation held where you didn't intend it to be heard. I have a copy stored elsewhere. I'm saying this not to threaten, but to spare us the insult of make-believe." Color moved under the skin of Caleb's cheekbones. Mara's smile stiffened at the corners and then relaxed as if she remembered a lesson. "People say silly things when they're frustrated," she said, airy. None of that was literal. I'm relieved to hear that I said and meant that I was relieved to be done with the pretense of hearing. "You may leave the documents. I will read them if I choose." "You won't stay." Ms. Albright slid the top stack back into her folder with the elegance of a magician returning a card. "If you change your mind," she said, standing, "we'll be reachable." "I've always been reachable," I said. "That is not the same thing as reachable for." They left with the faint perfume of Mara's hair products and a draft from the door that cooled the room in a hurry. The house took a breath. I gathered the papers they had handled and placed them in a gallon freezer bag the way you might store something spillable. I washed my hands. That evening I made soup from the things a kitchen always has, if you've kept it kindly: an onion, 2 carrots, a handful of lentils, a heel of bread staggered into croutons. I ate at the walnut table, the ranunculus leaning toward the last of the light. I thought I was done for the day with the revelations, and then I saw the blue pinprick above the bedroom door. It wasn't the smoke detector. The smoke detector is an honest red. This was the shy blink of a machine pretending not to be there. I fetched the step stool and a pocket mirror and angled it until the molding offered up a glass pinpoint the size of a poppy seed. It chilled me in a way the afternoon had not. Betrayal inside language still lives in the place where arguments occur. Betrayal inside the sprinkler of your privacy is a different genus entirely. I sat at the kitchen table with the lamp on and the USB drive beside the ranunculus. It took me 3 tries to find the number I wanted in the old address book, the one that still lists restaurants long closed. Noah Rhee, an engineer who used to troubleshoot Graham's stubborn ham radio rigs, and in time became the sort of friend who showed up with persimmons and left you half the box. "Noah," I said when he answered, his voice full of sleep or peace, "I need you to look at something in the morning." He arrived at 10 with a backpack that looked like a careful child, and a gentleness that didn't require questions. He examined the doorframe, then the hallway, then the bedroom, moving with the patience of someone who knows how to make a skittish animal trust a hand. He found 3 devices, one facing the bed, from the crown molding, one near the hallway vent, angled toward the bathroom, and one disguised as a button inside the closet's back panel. He set them each on a dish towel, like eggs, pried open their casings, with a tool that looked like a dentist's pick, and traced their little radio hearts. "They ping a cloud service," he said, showing me a tiny printed board. "Subscription-based." He connected his tablet, typed in a set of numbers, and frowned. "Registered to an email alias that uses Mars business domain." I stood very straight. "Are you sure?" I asked, though I had asked no such questions about the voice message. He nodded. "If you want, I'll bag them and label everything in case you decide to." "Please label them," I said, "and leave them with me." After he left, the house felt newly unarmed. That blue blink had colonized my sleep before it was even dark outside. I brewed chamomile. I cleaned the kitchen for the second time just to watch the sponge make something orderly where my mind could not. I stepped onto the porch. The maple whispered as if gossip had currency among trees. Across the street, Mrs. Penfield was cutting her roses with a pair of shears older than both of us. She wore a cardigan the color of rain and shoes that had been good shoes for decades. "You keeping well?" she called without looking up. I crossed the street. "Can I ask you a question that will sound incorrect?" I said. "Those are my favorite," she said, and waited. I told her a version of the truth that belonged on the sidewalk, not in a deposition. A blinking light. A device where no device should be. Words said that had no business seeking a passport into my kitchen. She clipped a rose and considered it the way a person considers a headline. "My eldest tried something like that," she said at last, as if reporting the weather. "Said he worried about falls. I told him if I fell, I'd yell. That was 8 years ago." She laid the rose in her basket. "I changed my locks that day and put his name in a box in the hall. You can love a child and still keep your house." I thanked her. We didn't hug. Some conversations want hands quiet at your sides. Back inside, I taped a blank index card above the desk and wrote a single word on it with a felt-tip pen, "Reclaim." I didn't write a list. I didn't need one. The word was a river with its own banks. The next morning, the kitchen light was already practicing. Being kind when the phone rang again. Theo's voice, careful. "Ms. March, one quick thing. Our system flagged an attempt to access your profile from an unrecognized device. We blocked it. You're secure." I thanked him and realized the coffee had gone cold in my hand without my noticing. Before lunch, I drove to Nora's Copy and Print, a shop that smells like toner and new cardboard. A teenager with chipped nail polish scanned the USB for me, printed a transcription of its audio, and slid it across the counter in a plastic sleeve. "Want me to staple?" she asked. "No," I said. "Not yet." I had a sense that I'd done something old-fashioned and therefore durable. On the way home, a small wind rose and threw yellow leaves into a spiral above the intersection at Bristol and 9th. I parked and watched them. People drove through as if seasons weren't always in part traffic. In the rear view, I caught my own face, which seemed to have decided to tell more truth than it used to. I put the car in gear and went home. The rest of the day I gave to tasks that didn't need applause. I vacuumed under the bed where the lost sock and the old receipt live like retirees. I watered the geraniums and pinched their brown blossoms into a bowl for the compost. I sorted the drawer by the phone rubber bands to one side, extra light bulbs to a shoebox, batteries tested and arrayed like tiny soldiers who've learned to wait. Near dusk, a padded envelope arrived with the mail. Inside, a brochure for a senior residence 2 towns over, glossy as a promise. A sticky note on the cover in Mars handwriting said, "Only if you want less hassle, Ma Evie." I ran my thumb over the nickname that had been retired without ceremony. I placed the brochure in the freezer bag with the afternoon's papers and sealed it with its gentle blue zipper. Then I cooked rice and sautéed zucchini with garlic and lemon. I ate at the table, the ranunculus now leaning the other way as if they had listened and changed their minds. I rewound the record and played the same side twice. I washed dishes and dried them immediately, the way my mother insisted, because water spots meant something about character. Night settled without negotiation. In the bedroom, absence took up less room than it had the night before. I set Noah's labeled devices on the dresser, a small museum of what doesn't belong. I lay down with the lamp on and read a chapter of a novel where no one had to prove they were telling the truth. When I turned out the light, darkness felt exact, not menacing. Sometime in the deepest hour, I woke and reached for the index card in the next room as if it were a glass of water. Reclaim was there unbothered. I stood in the doorway and looked at the outline of the walnut table, the jar of flowers, the square of the window. Graham had always said, measure, twice cut. Once, leave enough wood to sand. I'm not making furniture, but the principle remains. In the morning, I dressed in a navy cardigan, the one Graham said made me look like I had a map in my pocket, and opened the curtains. The room received the light like news it could live with. I made tea and poured it into a single stoneware mug. I set it in the exact center of a saucer and did not reach for a second. The house kept its balance. The day held. The word on the card did not fade. By morning, the card above the desk still said, "Reclaim the ink," as sure as if it had dried there years ago. I set the kettle on, flipped the record, and called Elaine Litt first briefly to confirm filings and asked for a referral to someone who lived in the world of hearings and affidavits. She didn't hesitate. "Mabel Hargrove," she said, "litigation estate disputes. And she has a human heart." Mabel's office occupied the second floor of a brick building whose stairwell smelled of lemon oil and old verdicts. Her reception desk held a glass bowl of peppermints and a calendar still on last month. She came out herself, sleeves rolled, once hair pinned, with something that wasn't trying too hard. "Evelyn," she said as if we were beginning a conversation we both already understood. We sat at a small conference table, not the imposing desk, and I slid the USB, the transcription, and Noah's labeled devices across the wood. "We'll log chain of custody," she said, opening a manila folder and writing dates, times, initials, with the tidy impatience of someone allergic to sloppiness. "We'll also subpoena the service hosting these feeds. If the registration trails to your daughter-in-law's domain, we'll have it in black and white." "And the bank?" I asked. "We'll need a custodian of records," she said. "Preferably someone who remembers you as a person, not just an account." I thought of Theo and the way he had offered vigilance as if it were as normal as a deposit slip. I gave her his full name and the date he'd called about the blocked login. She noted both, then looked up. "Evelyn, I need to prepare you for a separate beat," she said. "If they're serious, they file a petition for guardianship. It's the tool of choice when people want access to a life. In that case," I said, and felt the words as practical rather than dramatic, "we should let the life answer." We didn't wait long. Late that afternoon, a knock came with the crisp knuckle music that means courier. A man in a navy jacket handed me a thin stack warm from the printer. "Petition for appointment of guardian and conservator," it read, with my name spelled correctly and everything that mattered spelled wrong. The pages spoke of confusion and paranoia of unpaid bills that were paid of a woman adrift who might endanger her financial well-being and personal safety without immediate supervision. The allegations were polite, like being criticized in church. I carried the stack to the walnut table and called Mabel. "Good," she said, which startled me until she added, "Now we can answer with structure." She dictated a list as I wrote forensic evaluation declarations from Noah and Theo affidavit from Elaine regarding the trust's status, photographs of the device's preservation, letters to internet service providers, and a request for expedited hearing. Also, she said, search your papers for anything in their hand that hints at a narrative. I thought of the freezer bag of documents Ms. Albright had laid out in my living room and how I had sealed it like soup. I slit the bag with a paring knife and worked through the stack. At the bottom of a set of draft forms, I found a yellow legal pad page in Mars tilted script. Make her feel unsafe alone. Call Dr. B. Prep him. Keywords confused, forgets dates, insomnia. Budget after Paris. There were little stars beside insomnia and budget, as if the whole business could be organized into a tidy life admin task. I flattened the page with my palm and slid it into a sheet protector. The next morning, Mabel sent me to Dr. Alice Levitt, a forensic psychiatrist with a waiting room painted in not quite sage and chairs that agreed with knees. Dr. Levitt didn't hurry. She asked what I cooked when I didn't want to think and watched me smile when I said lentils. She asked me to recite 3 words and find them again after we spoke about governance and grandchildren. She asked me to count back by 7s, which I did, until we both decided we'd each proven our point. She asked me where my trust documents were and how I understood their clauses. She asked who was president, which felt like a trick in a country where the answers come preloaded with someone else's opinion. She asked me plainly how I'd slept. Better, I said, since the bulb stopped blinking blue. 2 days later, the report arrived on Mabel's fax pages, light with authority that didn't have to shout. No cognitive impairment. Sound judgment. Consistent narrative. No psychiatric condition requiring intervention. She attached it to our response as Exhibit D. The letter doesn't win it, she said during a quick call, but it clears a path. We filed our response, a document of sentences that never shook. Attached were Noah's photographs. The transcription of the voicemail, the legal pad page, and Theo's declaration stating dates, times, and the blocking of an unrecognized device. There was also a short affidavit from Elaine confirming the trust posture and that I, as trustee, had not authorized any third-party access. Mabel wrote the argument spare almost dry that said, in effect, a woman making decisions others dislike is not a woman incapable of making decisions. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning at 9. The courthouse wore its columns like a memory of something older than human pettiness. I dressed in navy, the cardigan my husband admired for its sensible faith, and pinned my hair with the tortoiseshell comb I use when I mean business, but am not auditioning for severity. Mabel met me on the steps with a messenger bag and a cup of coffee she didn't let me refuse. Inside, the air had that particular chill that isn't about temperature. Caleb sat at the petitioner's table in a suit that changed how he filled a chair, but not how he filled a room. Mara wore a soft gray dress and the string of pearls I had given her at a birthday when we were still using nicknames. Their lawyer was not Ms. Albright. Today it was a man whose tie made different promises. He whispered and they nodded in small synchronized bows. We opened. Mabel stood without theatrics. "Respondent is present and represented," she said. Her voice made the ordinary sound like a decision. The judge peered over glasses and asked the customary questions that check whether everyone is who they say they are. Then the petitioners called Mara. She began in the key of tremor. "Evelyn used to be warm," she said, letting the words sit on the rail of the witness box long enough to earn pity points. "She hosted holidays. She took me to PT. She was so generous." She tilted her head. "But lately she's become forgetful, suspicious. She won't let us in without calling first. The attorney guided her with queries designed to lacquer. Sheets materialized a calendar of days. I did not answer texts within the hour. A grocery list that didn't include carrots, as if carrots were the metric for competence. A snapshot of my porch light left on at 10 in the morning. Mabel's cross was brief and didn't nibble. "Ms. Voss," she said, "did you place surveillance devices in the respondent's home?" Mara blinked, and in the blink weighed 4 versions of truth. "I, of course, not personally, but you subscribe to their cloud service with your business email." Mabel lifted a printout obtained by subpoena, the domain at the top, like a small flag. "Yes or no?" Mara's throat moved. "That was for her safety. And you drafted a note listing symptoms to describe her with confused forget states. Insomnia. That's context," she said. "We were organizing." "For Paris?" Mabel asked, gently laying the legal pad copy with the word Paris underlined in the clean light of the court. Mara's eyes brightened with heat she'd trained to pass as sorrow. "You're twisting." "No," Mabel said, soft as a dish towel. "We're reading." Next, Caleb testified and tried to sound like a son trapped in obligation. He spoke about bills he claimed I'd missed. Mabel produced canceled checks about a time I asked what day it was. I had been confirming for a doctor's appointment about a casserole I burned. I do not deny the physics of ovens. He said the word concern until it lost meanings it should have kept. When Mabel asked whether he had ever even once asked to review the trust documents rather than assume their contents, he looked at me as if I'd performed a magic trick with his name. Our side called Theo. He wore a suit that fit because he respected the building, not because he needed help from it. He spoke clearly about the flagged login attempt and how often he had watched transfers leave my accounts at a rhythm that suggested patterns unrelated to my own spending. He did not editorialize. He treated the court the way he treats ledger's numbers before narrative, but not blindly so. Noah followed. He set the 3 devices on a blue felt tray labeled as if they were fossils. He explained how they pinged a server, where the pings went, and how he captured the routing log. He did not say the word violation. He didn't have to. The devices lay there with their little eyes closed. Mabel handed up Dr. Levitt's report as a stipulation. Opposing counsel had reviewed it and decided they did not need to cross a psychiatrist in public. Then Mabel called me. I took the stand and told the truth without ornament because the truth already had edges. I said I changed the locks because the old ones were compromised. I didn't say by whom because Mabel had already shown it. I said I prepared food because food is what a person does with a day that has too much noise. I said I added the numbers because numbers are a language I still read when other languages misbehave. I said I had loved my son from a place that didn't require witnesses. I did not say the word forgiveness. It was not on the docket. Opposing counsel tried to hobby-horse me into appearing brittle. "Is it true you poured out a cup of tea intended for guests?" he asked. "It is true," I said. "There were no guests." He pursed his mouth. "And you kept a ledger of money given to your son and his wife." "I kept receipts," I said. "A habit from work, not a grievance." He held up a photograph printed from my social account of the ranunculus in my window. "Would you describe yourself as lonely?" "I would describe myself as a person," I said, and the clerk coughed into a sleeve that might have been laughter's cousin. We rested. The judge asked for a short recess and left to read things judges read with a pencil. I sat with my hands folded and studied the grain of the witness rail. Beside me, a bailiff checked the clock. Across the aisle, Mara dabbed at an eye that no longer watered. Caleb looked down and moved his foot in small arcs as if smoothing sand. When the judge returned, the room gathered itself. He adjusted his glasses and spoke in the tone of someone who has practiced not wasting words. The petitioners request guardianship and conservatorship over Ms. Evelyn March on grounds of diminished capacity and risk of mismanagement, he began. The record, including the forensic evaluation, financial declarations, and testimony, does not support such a finding. He set the papers in a straightened stack. The petition is denied. Additionally, the court is concerned by evidence of surveillance devices within the respondent's home and by attempts to access her accounts. While I do not reach criminal questions, I am issuing an order prohibiting the petitioners from entering the respondent's residence or accessing her financial information absent written consent. Any existing powers or authorizations are revoked. Cost to respondent. The gavel did not strike, it didn't need to. The sentence ended with a period the whole room could hear. For a breath, no one moved. Then chairs made their small wooden noises and the present resumed. Outside, the sky had decided on a patient gray. On the courthouse steps, Mabel handed me my copy of the order in a plastic sleeve. "You were steady," she said. "It makes my job easier when the truth has a spine." We didn't linger. She had a call. I had a house. At home, the maple accepted the day as if it had anticipated exactly this weather. I set the order on the walnut table and read it once without hunting for subtext. I placed Noah's devices in a shoebox and wrote "Unwanted" on the lid in tidy block letters. I took the pale linen dress off its nail and laid it in tissue in the bottom drawer because it was just cloth again, and cloth shouldn't be asked to hold anything heavier. In the kitchen, the ranunculus leaned in a new direction, petals grown looser. I rewound the record, then didn't play it. The kettle clicked, then sighed, then poured into one stoneware mug. I set it on its saucer, exactly centered, and carried it to the table, where a single placemat waited because someone had learned her own number. The card above the desk still said "Reclaim." I didn't need to look at it to remember. The room remembered for me. The house held its shape. The light found the wood and stayed. The order lay on the walnut table until the edges lost their curl. I slipped it into a clear sleeve, filed it under House Permanent, and closed the cabinet with the soft pressure you use for something that no longer argues. The shoebox labeled "Unwanted" went to the top shelf of the hall closet, out of sight but not out of record. The card above the desk still read "Reclaim." I no longer needed to check it. The room had learned the word. I wrote 3 notes by hand, one to Mabel, one to Elaine, one to Theo, and walked them to the blue mailbox on the corner. At the bank, I left a small paper sack of almond cookies with Theo's name, then bought a bunch of tulips, not because the kitchen needed them, but because color was an argument I wished to hear. I returned home, put the tulips in the preserved lemon jar, and opened all the windows. The house breathed like a thing that had been underwater and found the surface. 2 days later, I called a mover who did not ask for an inventory, only for a morning. I packed in the way a person edits drawer by drawer, rule by rule. The pale linen dress went into tissue at the bottom of a suitcase. The cobalt tin of tea rode in the passenger seat beside me like a chaperone. I left keys with Mabel in an envelope, not as an endnote, simply as a sentence finished. The apartment on the coast wasn't grand. A second-floor corner over a bakery that woke early, and a shop that sold postcards no one bought. The air smelled faintly of yeast and salt. From the kitchen window, the inlet kept changing its mind about color. A narrow balcony held 2 rusted chairs and a planter that remembered lavender. I scrubbed the planter, turned the soil, and planted new starts that looked uncertain and willing. The first morning there, I set the index card on a pushpin above the small table, "Reclaim" and boiled water. The stoneware mug felt right in a new place, the way a familiar word lands in a different sentence and still means itself. I drank with the window open until the room found the shape of one person. In town, I learned the library's hours and the way the light makes stripes across the biographies at 11. A flyer by the elevator invited Thursday morning creative circle 60+. I arrived with a blank pad and a pencil trimmed to its last number. There were 6 of us that day. Ruth with scones, Elise with watercolors. June with a laugh that made the vinyl floor less shiny. We sat at folding tables and pretended to talk about brushes while telling each other our weather. I sketched the ranunculus from memory and the curve of the inlet from the window I claimed without asking. When Elise asked what I used for purple, I showed her the crosshatch where blue leaned into red until neither apologized. Days arranged themselves without instructions. I learned the timing of the baker's first batch, the pause in traffic before the noon ferry, the exact point in late afternoon when the inlet went from pewter to mercury. I fixed a dripping faucet with a new washer and the feeling that certain tasks are at their core introductions to yourself. I made soup enough for 2 and put half in the freezer with a piece of tape that said another day. I walked the boardwalk and let the wind take the edge off the stories my head keeps on a shelf. A letter came with a return address I didn't know. The envelope was hand-addressed in careful blue ink, inside a note from a group that holds gatherings for older women who have been maneuvered by money and silence. Someone had seen the public record than the local coverage. They asked if I would speak at their fall meeting in the community hall near the pier. The invitation was plain date time, a small honorarium tucked like a leaf. I set it on the table and poured tea without deciding, then looked again and found my hand had already reached for a pen. The hall was the kind where graduations and pancake breakfasts happen, folding chairs, a wooden stage, a sound system that worked only if you treated it kindly. The women came with cardigans and pins and the kind of shoes that prove a life has had errands. They didn't need a manifesto. They needed a room that believed them. I told the story the way I would tell an architect how a house stands, what the frame was, where the load-bearing beams ran, which window stuck in winter and which door warped in July. I said I changed the locks. I said I turned a second cup upside down. I said I kept receipts because I always have. I didn't raise my voice. Somewhere in the back, a woman closed her eyes and kept them closed. Afterward, a stranger in a green scarf waited until the clapping became talk and the talk became small circles. She touched my sleeve with 2 fingers. I thought I was the only one who turned the cup, she said. We stood without speaking until the moment was done. She left with her scarf tied tighter, and I folded the program into thirds and slid it into my pocket. The lavender on the balcony survived the first salty wind. I trimmed what browned and watered what stayed. The apartment learned my steps kettle chair window page. On Thursdays, the library table was mine by arrival rather than reservation. I brought nectarines when they were good and a small square of cake when I could not help myself. Ruth pressed a recipe card into my palm for scones with grated orange peel. I tucked it in the back of the cobalt tin. One evening, the inlet turned glassy and the gulls went quiet. I set the stoneware mug on the sill and wrote 3 sentences in a narrow-lined notebook. Not for a book, not for proof, just to keep the day from slipping through without a mark. The water settled, the room agreed the cup was warm. I read them back and didn't edit. Before bed, I took the index card down, not because the word had finished, but because I could carry it without looking. I slid it into the cookbook Graham once used for Sunday pancakes between batter and griddle, a place the house would reach for when it wanted to feel like itself. I turned off the lamp. The room kept its balance. The lavender breathed. The inlet held the last seam of light and then let it go. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.